The Sapience Network and Fair Observer present, a multipolar world is also a polycentric world. In a world that is increasingly interconnected yet diverse, the concept of polycentricity has become more relevant than ever. Unlike the notion of a multipolar world focused exclusively on the reality of nation-states, the polycentric world is defined by multiple interacting centers of influence. These centers are not just geopolitical, but also cultural, technological, and economic. To navigate this complex landscape, dialogue is essential. Open and respectful communication allows for the exchange of ideas, the negotiation of differences, and the building of mutual understanding. By fostering dialogue, we can create a more inclusive and resilient global community. As we delve deeper into the intricacies of polycentricity, remember that our ability to communicate and collaborate across boundaries is key to addressing the challenges and opportunities of our interconnected world. Dialogue has been a cornerstone of human societies since the dawn of linguistic exchanges over 50,000 years ago. Our uniquely human ability to create and share a vast array of perceptions, techniques, ideas, narratives, laws, rules, values, and personal ambitions is what makes human cultures thrive and justifies our belief in civilization. Yet, in this era of technological advancement, something curious has happened. Dialogue persists, but the appetite for it seems to be waning. Or rather, the institutions we've built have allowed the art of dialogue to lose its prestige. Only a few decades ago, when our means of communication were far more limited than today, sharing took place essentially in two ways: on a regional or even global scale via broadcast media, and locally through direct communication. After its emergence in the 20th century, modern broadcast media, television, radio, entertainment, alongside more traditional newspapers, magazines, and books, served to generate and reinforce widely accepted norms. Local communication, principally in the form of dialogue, resulted in specific social and economic organization and action, with permanent but evolving consequences for the community. In other words, in their daily lives, most people were regularly exposed to two forms of communication: the monologue of broadcast media and the dynamic dialogue of local communication. Paradoxically, social media has consolidated the role of monologue as our dominant mode of communication. It provided a generation of what we now call influencers with a platform for their intelligence and creativity. But in so doing, it ennobled monologue, leaving little space for spontaneous dialogue. We can see the effects of the marginalization of dialogue everywhere. People have fewer occasions to communicate face-to-face as both their professional lives and leisure time is consumed in front of a screen. Moreover, the modern culture of individualism has imbued us with the idea that competition is the key to productivity, and therefore trumps collaboration. And yet, the greatest human accomplishments have always been the result of collaboration. Monologue tends to be competitive. A culture in which monologue dominates is a culture in which competition and conflict will be increasingly present. Dialogue is collaborative. A culture that fosters dialogue encourages collective problem-solving. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 ushered in a global order we now refer to as the unipolar world. The United States stood as the master builder and enforcer of a rules-based order to which all nations were bound. Unsurprisingly, in the 1990s, the notion of American exceptionalism, which described the U.S. as the indispensable nation, inebriated a generation of politicians. One nation had become the global influencer. At the same time, the World Wide Web, initially designed to allow direct communication between points across a network, began evolving into a predominantly broadcast medium exploited by corporate interests. Unlike the telephone in the 20th century that exclusively facilitated dialogue, the Internet quickly evolved into a dominantly broadcast medium. Whether the aim was to disseminate news or permit individuals to write blogs, dialogue began taking a back seat to monologue. We may conclude that it is no coincidence that in the conduct of global affairs, diplomacy, which relies on the art of dialogue, became equally marginalized. A new ideology was born, informing us that we should never speak to those who do not share our values. The behavior of the U.S. State Department and certain foreign ministries began to resemble the echo chambers fostered by social media. Some observers believe that the unipolar world gave way to an emerging multipolar world sometime in the last decade. We know that the center of gravity of the world's economy, formerly situated in the North Atlantic, has now moved to Central Asia. In the globalized unipolar world that emerged 35 years ago, it sufficed to follow the rules established by the leader. In a multipolar and multicultural world, dialogue becomes not only the basis of coexistence and commerce, but also the means of survival. Donald Trump's Secretary of State Marco Rubio surprised the world when, for the first time, a U.S. politician acknowledged that the world had become multipolar and that U.S. primacy had ended. We know that Trump's preferred form of dialogue is transaction. That may work to some extent in a multipolar world where one can haggle, like mafia clans, on the definition of zones of influence. But the world that is now emerging is not only multipolar, it is polycentric. Governments have the power to haggle amongst themselves, but in democracies they must also haggle with the people. If the 20th century's culture of communication was dominated first by the telephone and then by television, the 21st century is now experiencing a transition from domination by the model of the Internet to the disruption brought about by artificial intelligence. Unlike traditional media, AI has its own voice. If today our society is focusing on the content of the monologue AI produces following prompts created by humans, we are just beginning to discover that the voice can also participate in dialogue. Instead of seeing AI as a repository of knowledge and facts, with the power to overwhelm us in terms of sheer quantity, we would do well to see it as a useful partner in dialogue, especially as we seek to address complex problems. AI can know things about the world, but it cannot experience the world in any meaningful way. That means that, despite its breadth of knowledge and speed of processing, we will always be in a different and frankly superior position to the AI voice with which we engage in dialogue. We are faced with a new challenge, but it's the kind of challenge human societies have always been good at: perceiving and rapidly understanding changes in the environment and inventing ways to adapt. What this means with regard to a new challenge that we acknowledge as possessing intelligence is that we must revive and then refine our talent for dialogue. We know the frustration of disgruntled spectators who shout and throw objects at their TV screen. With AI, we can initiate, maintain, and develop a conversation marked by mutual respect. AI will be a major presence in the emerging polycentric world. Together, we can develop a culture not just of coexistence, but of constructive collaboration. We are currently witnessing the cracks in a world order undergoing a major transition. One of the obvious cracks has been the way democracy as a model for governance has failed to respond to the needs of the demos, the people themselves, who are supposed to be at its core. As we engage in the collective task of elaborating our culture for the age of AI, we can begin to correct the errors that have distorted our institutions, including the very notion of democracy. Our capacity for dialogue is the key to that effort. For a changing world, We need new landmarks and especially a renewed sense of collective values. That is the challenge that awaits all citizens of a truly polycentric world, in which a culture of crass competition can be superseded by a culture aligned on the values of complementarity and convergence.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.